All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Lauren and Jessica and Pat and Richeson for the invitation to teach and spend the afternoon with all of you. I'm very excited to share my experience in working with Casein. I have a brief presentation that I'd like to start the class with today. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Hopefully, everyone's looking at the same slideshow here of our reference. So again, my name is Hector Acuna. Thank you for being here. This is Color Theory and Composition with Richeson's Casein Paint. If you'd like to learn more about my work, you're welcome to visit my website, acunaarts.com, or on Instagram at Hector Acuna period art. Just a quick plug on my socials there. So this is the painting we'll be working on today. Before I jump into some kind of nuts and bolts of composition and color theory, I wanted to just take a quick second and talk about what I like about painting cars. I do a lot of outdoor painting as well as studio painting. I paint from observation in plein air, and I've noticed looking back that I'm drawn to cars for different reasons. And I kind of asked this question as I was preparing my presentation of what is it about cars that I find so interesting. I think it's in part because of the variety that they carry. We talk a lot about variety and unity and contrast as these principles within composition. And oftentimes it's the subject matter that provides us with something like variety, but we can also think about variety in terms of the position that we take on looking at the subject. So a car is a really unique form and it comes in different shapes and sizes and colors. But depending on where we stand as a viewer and as a maker, we can think about composition in really exciting ways. So if you're very far away, the car becomes very small and whole, complete as one form or object. Or you can stand really close to it and play with things like perspective and reflections on the surfaces. So these are some examples of oil paintings that I've made in plein air that kind of center on cars as a theme. So I wanted to share part of that experience with us today. Let's go ahead and keep moving here. So um, our reference for today was a photo that I took while on a bike ride on a trail that runs between two towns, Grafton, which is where I live, and Cedarburg. Both these towns are in Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee by about 30 minutes or so. So if you're ever in this area, maybe you'll see me biking around or painting in plein air. And there's this little parking lot right on the trail. You kind of have to go through the parking lot to keep going. And this car is usually parked in this lot. And I've passed it numerous times and eventually thought, I'm going to take a picture of it. Maybe it'll become a painting someday. And the image on the left is the original iPhone, really quick photo that I snapped. And when I was invited to teach this class, I kind of rediscovered this photo. And originally, I love the car, this Bel-Air car, because of the kind of rusty, historic character that it has, but also the drama of the lighting on the object, on the car itself. So there were a couple things inherent to the reference that I really was drawn to. However, the palette and the color just wasn't quite as interesting. It looked a little flat, so I wanted to edit some of those levels. So you can see the difference between the edited photo on the right, which is really intense in terms of saturation. We can really see more dramatic contrasts in temperature between warm colors and cool colors. And partially selfishly, I wanted to work with really intense pigments. And, if I enhanced my reference, I could then see the link between the palette and the reference material there. So in preparation for painting, drawing has always been a very foundational part of my process. I think it's where I've learned the most about translating visual information that is three-dimensional into a two-dimensional illusion on a two-dimensional plane. And it simplifies that process by eliminating some of the variables, especially things like color properties. So in drawing, we're really thinking about proportion, we're thinking about perspective, we're thinking about volume and the planar structure of the form. And this car in particular has kind of a boxy character to it. So it's really easy to find those planes and to notice those differences in color property then in things like value and temperature and so forth. So everyone should have access to this image on the right, this little graphic that I put together. I'm not going to read through it. just to save time. But there's two different images. It's the same drawing, and it's really small. It's about this big in a sketchbook, just with a graphite pencil. And I wanted to show kind of that halfway point of the drawing where you can maybe sort of reverse engineer my process in terms of finding and noticing those planes of the volume. And the other thing I wanted to point out is when you're drawing, especially in a thumbnail sketch like this, it's a preliminary exercise. So it's an opportunity to gain some insight into the subject. And when I'm going to start the painting, I'm going to have to think about these planes and the direction that these planes sit in space. So when you're sketching, my recommendation is to really think about the orientation of your lines, right? So, if I zoom in here for a moment, this sketch on the top right, you can see where that initial block-in shape on the left side of the driver's side of the car is sort of filled in with hatching lines, but the direction of those lines, the orientation, is helping kind of describe the way that that plane is moving in space. So really think about that when you're sketching, especially if it's a preliminary sketch for a painting. Here's a better image of the finished thumbnail. I always tell students like it's great to learn things in the sketch, but that's not what you're going to put in a frame and show in an exhibition or a show, right? We're going to make a painting. So don't spend too much time on the sketch. It's really there for you to learn things about contrast and values and proportions and perspective. So this is probably like a 10 to 15 minute sketch, which might sound like a lot of time, or maybe not. It's all relative. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about color. Oops, sorry about this. My window just got stretched there. So color has three main properties, and those are hue, chroma, and value. Some of this is probably review for a lot of us, but that's all right. So hue, there's typically six families that we think about when we can place a color into. Those are the primaries and then the secondaries. So red, yellow, blue, and then we mix those three together to get our secondary colors, green, violet, and orange. So hue is one of the three properties of a color. The next property is chroma. That's its intensity. Purity sometimes is a word that we'll use. Saturation is another word that we will use. Chroma is the word that I use most often. And if a color has no sense of a hue at all, so it's just gray, then it's achromatic, right? There's no hue at all. But there's a range between achromatic and really, really intense color, and that range gives us its level of chroma. So I've kind of illustrated this idea with the word chroma in the slide. You can see where that blue is getting less and less intense until it's eventually just gray. The third property of color is value, and that's the relative lightness or darkness of a color. Now, when we say relative, we're talking about a relationship of two or more colors, right? We need at least two to be able to say that one is bright or dark, or brighter or darker than the opposite one, right? So always think in terms of relationships for these different properties and contrasts. And I just wanted to give everyone a quick look at something that you can do that's a really helpful exercise, which is to make your own value scales from scratch. I really recommend doing this for two reasons. The first reason is that you'll have your own product of a value scale. The second reason is that you'll learn to see those really subtle shifts in light and dark relationships of values. And especially if you choose to make a chromatic black as opposed to like a ivory black or a Mars black or something like that. If you take two complements like blue and orange, I usually recommend using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. That'll give you a really nice dark neutral. And then if you add white or tint up that color, you can get this range of values. So that's an exercise I would encourage people to try at some point. And you can make your own little scale by taking a ruler and paper. If you're working in oil, if you seal the paper with a medium of some kind, that'll help protect it and make it last a bit longer. And then in terms of value, you can choose to key your paintings between a higher key and a lower key. And basically what that means is that you're going to choose to limit or compress the range of contrast and values. And I wanted to just show this because it provides an example of maybe whether or not we need to show the full range of values in a painting to discern or describe a form. This one on the left is the middle value to white, the higher key. The one on the right is the middle value to black. And, in both examples, the middle value is either the darkest value in the painting or it's the brightest value in the painting. And basically, it's giving us this example of those relationships in describing the forms and not needing that full range in values. So this is another exercise I would encourage people to do. This was just like a little still life with oil paint on paper. Okay, so looking at our reference again, so I have my drawing, I have my edited photo reference that we're going to be working with. One other thing I wanted to do prior to getting into the process is showing another step that you can add to your preliminary sort of learning process, which is to make a value study in the medium that you're going to be working with. And again, there's benefits to doing these things. One of the reasons I would recommend doing that is so that you can kind of feel out the medium without using a wide palette of colors. And we can get a feel for working more transparently or more opaquely in our process. So this was a really quick, again, really small little thumbnail painting using casein. I think I used raw umber and the Shiva phthalo green to make this with a little bit of titanium white to tint some of those as well. But at that scale, especially, we can also start to play with this idea of using economy or economic decisions to say a lot with very little information. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts about painting is that we don't have to recreate our photo reference with every, leaf or branch on a tree, or every little scuff on the car. The viewer can kind of fill in those gaps. They can pull from their own memory of this type of a scene and recall some of those details. So as the artist, we have a lot of room to kind of play with simplification and abbreviation in terms of detail. So I think this stage of making a little value scale is another way to practice ways that you might want to simplify your paintings. Okay, and just to give us a quick, very objective look at the palette of today's painting. So we're using titanium white, raw umber. I'm using alizarin crimson. I don't have the Shiva red with me or the rose red at the moment. Yellow ochre and phthalo green. I think the alizarin is going to be pretty close in terms of color properties. It might be a little less archival, as many artists know with traditional alizarin crimson, but we should be able to get a similar range in terms of color properties with our red. Now, what we'll notice is that the phthalo green is kind of our coolest color on the palette, right? So it's sort of our fill-in for our blues. This is kind of a primary palette. We have a red, a yellow, and now a blue, kind of a bluish green, and then an earth tone with our raw umber to help kind of neutralize and mute some of these colors. So each of those pigments is shown in the color chart that I made by adding different amounts of white. And just to give me a really quick look at what this palette is capable of. And this is one of the reasons why making color charts can be really helpful. And then these three columns on this same page here in the middle show those primaries mixed with each other, right? So when I mix alizarin with my phthalo green, I can get this really nice, dark, pretty neutral range of red and green because they're complements, right? Complementary colors. Yellow and the yellow ochre and the phthalo green give me a really nice middle green that I can use, especially for the base of the local color of our car. And then yellow ochre and alizarin open up this really beautiful peachy orange range of hues. And then this chart on the right is another chart that I've made with oil paint. This is a quick graphic just to show you that idea I was talking about a few minutes ago between ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. If we cross mix those two because they're also complementary colors, we can get this, in theory, we should be able to get a perfect middle achromatic neutral, right? Which is this dark neutral in the left part of the chart. And then by adding white, we can get this range in values. And if we lean that middle neutral more towards ultramarine blue or more towards burnt sienna, we can have a more chromatic neutral in a cooler side of the palette or the warmer side of the palette. So again, this is just a way for us to see kind of where we're able to move as a painter with this given palette. And by limiting our palettes, we're not only kind of limiting the potential to complicate the process, but we're also increasing the potential to harmonize or unify our paintings, right? Because there's just a greater chance that you're going to be using one yellow in different mixtures as opposed to two or three yellows. So using a limited palette is also really helpful in that regard. We're almost done with the presentation here. So I was thinking about the car and, its sort of generic basic form, which is kind of a box, as I mentioned a little while ago. So if we simplify the car, it's basically a box. And this is another really small little casein sketch in a sketchbook. of a box that I sort of just invented and thought about similar lighting conditions as the car. So the sunlight is coming in from behind the back right corner of the car, and the driver's side of the car that is moving away from us towards its receding point or vanishing point is in shadow, right? But it's the value is not as dark as the shadow that's below the car. And I was really thinking about the anatomy of light on this object, right? So, excuse me, if the light is hitting the top of the box, that's the brightest value. It's also the coolest because it's facing the sky, right? So the it's bouncing light off of the coolness of the sky as opposed to the planes that are vertical, right on both sides at this 2 point perspective point. Those planes are going to be a lot warmer because of the light that's hitting the ground and bouncing onto the car, right? So when we think about painting an object in an environment, whether that's natural light or artificial light, really take a moment during your process to think about how the light is bouncing off of these different planes and informing those three properties of color, right? Value, hue, and chroma. So I noticed that there's kind of a warmness when I was looking at my photo reference to those planes, and I tried to experiment with that at this very simple building block stage. And then the last slide I have is just a combination of these different stages and steps, and you can see where they sort of relate to one another. One thing I wanted to point out with the color chart that I made and this example painting is that the like looking at the phthalo green and its brightest value, that's a really intense kind of turquoise color, and in the painting we don't really see that color present in many places, if at all. And so the same is true with some of the alizarin crimson hues and tints, and I wanted to kind of point this out that most of this painting is actually in a fairly neutral, chromatic neutral range in terms of chroma. And even though we're going to start with some pretty intense colors, a lot of the process is actually going to be dealt with mixing them together to kind of tone down their intensity or chroma. And then again, you can see a side by side of the box with the painting of the car and these three sort of planes where these different planes of the box sort of meet and how their values and their color properties are going to be shifting. So I think that's pretty good for the presentation. Thanks for sticking that out with me here. Let me stop sharing my screen. Actually, maybe I'll adjust my camera first before I let go of the presentation. So I've got things set up here on a table in my studio and should be able to see my mixing area, the photo reference. I have to take off this portrait lighting here. Stop sharing. There we go. Let's see. So you just hang on for just one moment while I get things situated here. Okay.
Hector, as you get started, we have a great question here from Mark. He is asking about the key differences between casein and gouache.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Gouache is another medium I've spent a lot of years working with. The biggest difference right off the bat that I would say is that casein is not going to reconstitute or re-wet as easily as gouache will. And this is one of the things I like about casein is once the painting is done, it's a little less fragile than gouache is going to be. They both dry to a pretty similar surface quality. They both have kind of a matte surface. And again, that's something I really prefer because we're really looking at the properties of the pigment in those paintings then. And when something is really glossy, we're also seeing like the light reflecting off of the surface. So casein is similar to gouache in that regard. They're both water soluble as we've discussed already. So they thin down really nicely, kind of like a watercolor will. And because of that, because they still have an opaque range, it's a really versatile medium in terms of the process. So I'm an artist that makes a lot of mistakes. I tell people that all the time, and I prefer mediums that allow me to kind of rework areas. Casein is one of those mediums, and because it dries relatively quickly, it dries really quickly compared to oil paint. You can make these decisions and correct things really quickly, which is really handy. So those are the things that come to mind right away when I think about casein as opposed to gouache. And they also come in tubes. The one thing I will note about using casein is that unlike gouache, the way that I like to use gouache is by squirting it into watercolor pans and then traveling with like a watercolor palette that way. With casein, it'll dry in that palette and you won't be able to re-wet it. So you have to squirt it out onto your palette each time you're painting. One thing that you can do to extend its drying time on the palette is to take a paper towel and like this little strip of blue shop towel here was dipped into my water container and I squeezed out the excess water and then laid it out on the palette. And then I put my paint on that piece of wet paper towel. The moisture in the paper towel will help keep that paint a little bit more moist over time, and can kind of keep that working time a little bit more open. So, just going through my setup here, I've got my 7 by 10-inch piece of paper taped to a piece of plywood. So it's really easy to just take this off and bring it closer to the camera if we need to see some close-up details. I've got my color chart clamped to this tabletop easel. I've got my iPad with the photo reference to the left. I've got my initial demo painting here on another easel behind the table. And then I've got the sketchbook page opened up to those exercises that I was talking about. My palette that I'm using today is a piece of plexiglass that has a piece of gray paper duct taped to the back side. So it's a really quick, simple solution, super lightweight. It's not going to crack and break like a piece of glass will. And it's really easy to clean up when we're done painting. So that's a recommendation. The Richeson disposable paper pads, palette pads are also going to be really helpful for a medium like casein. And I've got my water cup over here. I have a second one just in case the first one gets really, really cloudy and muddy. And I'm noticing that if like the, kind of deep dark purples or other colors are mixing with my brighter values, I might use a second cup of water. Um, and then I have my tubes of paint here on the side just in case I need more paint. And the last thing I'll talk about here are the brushes that I'm using today. These are the same brushes that were on the material list. So we have two different flats. These are the Richeson Gray Matters brushes. These are really, really nice brushes. I like their brushes a lot. I use them a lot, especially between these different mediums of gouache, casein, egg tempera. I've used these brushes with too, and they've held up really, really well. I've had these ones for years now. And so I've got a 3/4 inch flat brush and a 1/4 inch flat brush. So there's a big difference between the size of those two brushes. And especially when painting something like this car, this architectural kind of scene, there's a lot of organic subject matter, but there's a lot of man-made or human-made objects as well with pretty sharp edges and angles. These flat brushes are going to be pretty handy in getting that character of shape with the subject matter. And then I have two different rounds. I have a number 1 and a number 8. These are the same ones again as what was listed for you. So again, the key thing here is a variety in size and shape. So with 4 brushes, I'll be able to pursue a pretty vast vocabulary of mark making or alphabet of mark making, which again, going back to this idea of variety or contrast, those are those two realms of composition that give our paintings a lot of interest, visual interest. So I'm always thinking about ways to incorporate more variety into my process, and how that relates to elements that are unified as well. So I'm going to start out by dipping my 3/4 inch flat brush into the water here. The paint, as I mentioned, is on this moist towel, so it's already like very open and ready to be used. And I'm going to start by thinning down a couple of my colors. So I'm taking this water and I'm just starting like a little pool on the palette. And my apologies for the distance of my setup here. I've just got the one camera, but as I mentioned, I can always bring the painting up closer to us. So the first thing I want to think about are the big shapes, right? Going back to this value sketch that I made here. I'm thinking about the darkest darks and all these middle values between the darkest shapes and the brightest shapes and where to locate those big relationships. So I'm going to start by making a fairly neutral color. I'm going to grab a little bit of the phthalo green, and I'm not really adding paint to the brush. I'm basically just sort of staining the hairs of the brush at this point and thinning that out with that pool of water. And I'll grab its complement, in my case, the alizarin, or in your case, I think it's the rose red. And together they make this really dark, kind of neutral greenish purple, which is a really beautiful color that has a lot of subtle hue and subtle chroma that a black right out of the tube won't give you. And again, this is why I would recommend making your own chromatic grays and blacks. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to use this really thinned out color to start to draw in some of these big shapes. So I'm looking at the shadow below the car and I'm just thinking about where that shadow is in relationship to the bottom of my painting, right? How high up does that shadow start on the left side of my painting? So again, we're painting, so if you don't have it in the perfect spot, it's no big deal, right? We can always paint over it and adjust those relationships really easy and really quickly, especially with this medium. So I'm looking over at my iPad with the reference here and mostly thinking about those big landmarks. So I'm not looking at details, I'm just thinking about this one shape of the shadow on the parking lot below the car. And also where that value comes up into the wheel well in the front, right? So I can kind of make a little vertical sort of square element on top of that shadow. And the second or the rear wheel back here, and already I'm thinking, yeah, that's probably not the right spot, but that's okay. I can adjust that later. Something that I notice a lot when I'm teaching is, especially when we have a blank sheet of paper, right? That's really intimidating because you have yet to decide where something begins. Now, to know if something is in the right place, it has to actually be in the painting, right? So the first couple marks and decisions we make are usually the scariest because we're not sure if we're putting things in the right place, but you have to get something down to then decide, oh, that's too high or that's too far away. So now I'm looking at the top of the door on the driver's side of the car and just thinking about, where some of those shapes might go for the windows, where the rear window and the back of the car might sit. So I'm using a mix of shape and line here to map things out in the painting. And I try to work really fast. That's something that I think is really difficult to figure out when we're seeing a finished painting. We don't have the privilege of seeing the process and seeing how quickly the artist got to these different stages of their painting. And by working quickly and bouncing around the canvas or the paper in this case, you're really thinking about the relationship of multiple things when we do this, right? And I think that's really important. Instead of starting at one corner of the painting and then finishing the painting from there, this is going to allow us to kind of keep our focus on all of the proportions and all of those relationships periodically. So I'm just looking for other dark values in the reference. There's a minivan in the background over here somewhere. So I'm just going to put in a shape just to represent that part of the painting. I've got this tree line on the edge of the parking lot on the right side. There's a tree that's getting cut out of the frame on the right over here. And then the tree line above that minivan, I don't know if you can see, but back here, is also pretty dark value. It's not as dark as the minivan, but it's pretty close. So I'm just going to use the same color to carry over these shapes back here. And you might be thinking, well, it's pretty green, or it's kind of a lime green in some areas. That's all right, right? We're going to work on top of this and build up these layers. So this is mostly about establishing, in some ways, the drawing of the painting. We're organizing the proportions and these elements to get things in a pretty close place to where they might need to be by the end. There's also a darker shape kind of up here. There's a tree line behind the house in the background. So I'm kind of using a dry brush right now. There's not a lot of water in the brush. And I kind of, I actually really like the texture that I'm getting with the dry brush. So, at the early stage of a painting like this, I think if there's ever a time to experiment, now is the time, right? This is the time to really allow yourself to try some things that maybe you don't typically do in terms of the amount of water in your paint or the type of brush that you're using or the way that you're holding the brush. The more we add in and build into this painting, I think the more attached we start to become. And it's really easy to feel like, well, I can't do this now because that might mess up this area. It's amazing how psychological the process is when we make a painting, and how much of the process is actually just happening up in our mental space, and that's sort of preventing us from trying things. So, um, let's go ahead and mix up another neutral here, but with white, a little bit of white. So this is giving me kind of a milky grayish, purpley color. And I'm seeing this color in a few areas. This is kind of close to the house in the background. This is a kind of a cooler color and temperature back here. So I can fill in that house. I can carry this over into other areas and other shapes. So I'm thinking about temperature at this point and value, and trying to place in some of these initial areas of temperature. The shadows on the parking lot are pretty cool. There's a fairly cool shadow on the lower side of the right, rear side of the car, of this Bel-Air car, and where that's leaving the picture plane. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the same color here. Now, when I mix up a color like this, I try to find as many areas of the painting that I can put that color into, to save time, but also to create harmony and unity in the painting, right? So if we see one color sort of reappearing in multiple areas, the eye is going to naturally connect those parts of the painting. And we're going to find opportunities to, connect varying points of interest. And I think that's where composition also becomes really exciting, is that we can kind of decide how we want to relate different shapes in different areas. Um, Overall, I'm still working with a fairly thin paint consistency. I'm trying not to use too much paint too early, and it's allowing these shapes and colors to dry relatively quickly because it's just a very thin layer of material in and on the paper. And as I've been saying, I'm sort of bouncing around, looking for multiple shapes that fit this sort of darker middle value range, and also a cooler temperature. So when I'm looking at the reference, that's what I'm thinking about. It's like, where do I see darker, cool shapes? And how can I go ahead and just get those in right now, before I move on to the next category of shapes? All right, let's add in some greens because there's a lot of green in this reference. So I'm going to start with my yellow ochre, and I'm just going to mix right into that same pile that I had on the palette, which is still fairly wet. And I can add a little bit more water to keep it thin. I got a little bit of the phthalo green that I'm mixing in. Now, the beautiful thing about this palette, right, is you can make your green with yellow ochre and phthalo green. And if that green is too intense, all we need to do is add either a little bit of our red or the raw umber, and that's going to kind of tone down the chroma of the green, right? Because red and green are complements. So if we mix them together, we'll get this really nice range of neutrals. So I can add a little bit of my alizarin here just to tone this down. I don't want it to get too intense too early. I think it helps if we can stay fairly um, neutral in the beginning stages of the painting, because then we always have access to those really intense, rich, chromatic areas of our palette. So I'm trying to mix up this kind of dark brown color. I'm just going to pop this into areas where I also see a darker greenish brown. So there's a little bit of warmth back here. These shadows in the background are fairly warm, and that's partially because of the editing that I did to the file. All right, let's lighten this a little bit here. And we'll try to get into range. I'm going to try to get into the range of the driver's side plane of that car. So let's try this. This is a little thick for my liking at the moment, so we're going to thin that down with some water and carry this over. And you'll also notice I haven't switched brushes yet. I'm still using the biggest brush that I have access to, and that's intentional. I don't want to start getting into tiny details this early. I want to keep my attention and my focus on these big relationships of color and shape. It's also fun to, just from a process standpoint, I think it's really fun to try to see how far you can get with one tool because it forces us to explore the ways that that tool can offer a descriptive language in terms of shape and line and mark making. Um, it's really, I think it's really easy to feel like, oh, I have to have a different brush for every mark that I want to get, but it's the way that we use the tool that makes it worthwhile in our process. So I would encourage you to try this too and really limit your choices in terms of the tools. That's a little too dark, so I'm going to thin this out, add a little bit of titanium white. I can also start to think about this rear trunk area of the car and just figure out some of those proportions. All right, now let's move into some of the foliage on the left side of the reference here. So I'm adding in yellow ochre, a little bit of our phthalo green. I'm going to thin this out and I'm just going to go ahead and fill in most of this area. Now, what you'll notice as you start to layer your washes and your layers of casein is that it's similar in some ways to glazing that you can get in other mediums, where you'll still see that initial shape that you put in earlier in the process, and it's a really beautiful medium for allowing artists to think in terms of layers and to think in combination of different layers in their paintings. So even though you've painted a shape, you can kind of glaze over it and alter some of those color properties that I was talking about, whether that's chroma or hue. Right? So just in this one pass, and I'm kind of allowing the paint to dry at different rates. I'm moving my brush around. I'm able to get a nice variety of shape and texture and color properties, as opposed to using a very opaque amount of paint and then just covering that entire area. Working with a more fluid consistency allows the paint to take on some organic sort of properties that you can use to your advantage to make something feel more organic, like this tree line on the left. All right, we're just going to carry this all the way down here. I'm noticing a little bit of a green down in this edge of the shadow over here, so I'm just going to carry this over. All right, we'll bring the same mixture up in the background, right? So the other thing I liked about this reference is that it has a very clear distinction between foreground, middle ground, background. And regardless of what we choose to paint, I think if we can focus on those relationships in terms of depth, it can help us decide what to do at what stage of a painting. And, you might look at a shape and go, well, that's kind of a really a cool temperature. And if it's in the foreground, if it's the same color you're using in the background, what's going to happen most likely is that those two shapes are going to feel like they're at the same depth of field. Now, there's other properties still, right? We still have value and chroma, so you can alter those properties of one or the other to separate them in a painting. A lot of times, what we're doing when we're painting is we're creating this. sort of puzzle for the viewer to put together when they look at the painting, right? So we have to be mindful of how we're cueing them into those relationships. And the more we make two things similar that are, for that example, at very different depths of field, it can get kind of confusing as a viewer to know, well, how far away is this house in the painting or this minivan that's way off in the distance? And if I'm thinking about those relationships, I'll remember to vary some of the properties in color to separate them. All right, let's work on the car here in the foreground. Get some of these proportions back to a closer area. So I'm going to add a little bit of white to that grayish green mixture that I was using for the tree line. So it's bringing the value up. It's also lowering the chroma by adding white in this case. So I can get to more of a middle neutral. The the reflection and the values inside of the car are they're dark in relationship to this plane of the trunk, but they're lighter than other relationships of other surrounding shapes. So you have to be kind of always thinking about multiple points of contrast in those relationships. I'm just going to fill this in, kind of glaze over that. There's a second car parked behind the Bel-Air that is a white car, which in this case is a little tricky because, the back of the Bel-Air is a very bright value, and it almost feels like there's a moment where the cars are like one shape. They're kind of connected. And later on in the process, we can talk about ways to just ever so slightly uh, separate those two forms. But for now, I think it's actually helpful to think of them as one very bright value and very bright shape because it's going to keep those proportions in check a little bit easier. All right, so I'm taking my alizarin and the phthalo green, and I'm going to go back into my shadow because now the shadow is not very dark, right? It's kind of started to dry. It's a much brighter value. It was thinned out to a point that it was always going to be a pretty light value. But now that I've established some of these other shapes, I can go back to that and lower the value while also correcting some of the edges and proportions. So I'm making a mixture with my red, my green, and a little bit of the raw umber too. Because again, in my photo reference, it's everything's pretty warm. So I don't want to use a ton of my phthalo green because I want it to feel like a hot summer day.
We have a couple questions, Hector. The first is about mixing casein. Could you mix it with a watercolor or gouache or use it as some sort of mixed media project?
You know, I've never done that. It's a really interesting question. I haven't personally tried that with other mediums. If I'm being totally honest, I've always stuck with just casein if I'm using casein. What I really like to do is make paper panels. I'll get paper that's archival. It's like printmaking paper I really like a lot because it's pretty heavy and it can take a lot of like push and pull of paint. And I'll mount that with a like a book binding or like an archival PVA sort of glue to panels. And then I have a really nice hard support that I'm painting on. And that would work really well, I think, if you wanted to do mixed media because you could draw on there, you could paint over that. But I know some artists that will combine gouache and casein. Like I think James Gurney is someone that I've seen in videos where he'll take casein and create a wash in a sketchbook and then paint with gouache on top of that. I don't know if the opposite would work as well because, as I said in the beginning, gouache reconstitutes or re-wets really easily. Um, but yeah, in my experience, I've always just used casein, but that's a
Sounds
great question.
And then a question about the content of the painting. Would you ever consider not painting the secondary car? Mark is asking about. If
Totally. Yeah, this is one of the things, right, where, you know, we as the person who's making a painting, it's always up to you to decide what's worth the vision that you have, in terms of the story that you want to tell or what you like about the reference, what you don't like about the reference. For me, I kind of um, I liked that extra little middle ground piece of information of the car. I had debated, I think, in the original reference to change the color of that car, but because I'm showing the reference and I'm teaching off of this photo, I wanted to kind of keep things true to the photo reference there. But yeah, I mean, that's something that we always can decide to do is to shift the properties of the reference to suit our needs in terms of the message we want to portray or the focus of a contrast, right? I mean, as I mentioned, the values of that car and the trunk are so close that it kind of like weakens the contrast or the impact of the trunk shape, right? Because there's a brighter shape right next to it. Those are reasons where I would decide, well, you know what? Maybe I don't need that bright value right next to this car. Maybe I'll shift or I'll tone down the value of that second car, for example. But I mean, when I'm thinking about things like that in editing, those are usually the reasons why I would choose to change or alter something is because of the relationship that it's creating currently in the painting.
That's great.
Hopefully that,
Thank you.
yeah, great questions. All right, so I'm again thinking about the proportion of my shadow shape. Um, if we look closely at the reference, the shadow gets a little bit lighter and it almost has kind of a greenish hue to it. So I don't want to carry this all the way to the edge. I'm going to sort of feather this edge and vary the angle that the brush is putting down paint so it feels organic. Now, this part of the shadow over here is a really dark, consistent, sharp shape. So there I can be really precise about the edge of that shape because in the photo, especially, it has this really clear character in terms of its shape. Um, and if I did that on this side, it might feel really flat and kind of like a sticker. So I'm already thinking about how do I make that feel organic, this transition from really dark to slightly lighter and slightly greener in hue. All right, let's move away from the shadow and let's get some of our other darks in here. So part of what I'm doing is I'm lowering my values, I'm correcting the values, but I'm also correcting the proportions. You know, let's face it, my initial block-in was not perfect, but that's okay. This is what I love about painting. This is why I'm not a sculptor or, I don't work in a much more precise type of material. I like painting because you can just kind of throw out an idea and then look at it and go, you know what? That's close, but let me adjust it. Let me try this instead. And that's the stage that I'm at right now. And to be totally honest, that's kind of the remainder of my process. It's sort of, you know, all about this adding and covering and taking away. All right, let's look for some other darker shapes in the car. Now, again, if we look close, there's another car just above the roof of our Bel Air. And we're seeing, again, this sort of shadow side because it's being sort of like backlit, side lit, sort of, at this sort of diagonal lighting angle. So that van or that SUV that's back there is a really dark shape. And I don't know if I want to make it super dark. In my original painting, I sort of loosely put in a shape kind of like this. And again, this comes back to this idea of how much information is really necessary and where can we simplify our reference material and our image. So I'm just going to put in some evidence that there's this other darker vehicle back there. All right, let's go ahead and try to get rid of some of this white blank paper here. Let's move into those hues. So I'm going to add in the yellow, this like ochre yellow in the foreground. I'm going to leave this pile where it is. There's some really nice color in that, so I might use it later. And I'll just move to a different part of my palette now. Kind of the same approach as you're noticing. I like to thin out the paint in the beginning, just to kind of block in the general value or temperature of my painting. And I'll grab a little bit of titanium white and more of the yellow ochre.
Hector, we do have a couple other questions while you're doing that. What do you use to clean your brushes?
For casein, I just wash them out with warm water as soon as I'm done painting. If you forget to wash your brush, I'm sure you could use like a master soap or um, hot water or warm water probably. And, um, you could probably use like a Murphy's oil soap or I keep those like tubs of the master's soap to wash my brushes. But with casein, usually I just rinse them out with warm water and they work well the next time I need to paint.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Um, Mark is asking, does casein shift in value like gouache or watercolor as it dries, or does it keep its value?
That's a good question too. Yeah, in my experience, I haven't noticed as dramatic of a shift in value or like other color properties that I've seen in gouache. Gouache is kind of notorious for that. And that's kind of the learning curve when you're using gouache. I personally haven't seen that as often with casein. And I run the risk of being like, it doesn't happen in casein, and then in 20 minutes we'll see it happen. So yeah, I'm not sure if every color has that same sort of drying effect. Um, but I would say gouache is a little bit more challenging in that way. I think part of the painting process too is really it's about gauging and judging the value relationships in the painting. And so much of what we do in terms of finding the color happens here, right, on the palette. But really what we have to keep an eye on is what happens here in the painting. So if you put in a wash and it feels dark, chances are it's feeling really dark because we're comparing it to the blank white value of the paper, right? And as we add in darker and darker shapes, that initial color that I put in is going to seem lighter and lighter. So that's also part of the challenge as we're painting in these layers and working with washes, for example. So I'm just going to add in this ochre wash in other areas here. Um, Also, full disclosure, if I'm remembering right, in my original painting, I think at the end of the process, I did add another color to the palette, which was the cadmium yellow medium from this line from Richeson, because I really wanted to see what would happen if I really amped up the yellows and the warm tones. So, we might not get the same intensity in the foreground in my reference, but that was how I got that level of chroma in the yellows. And part of teaching workshops like this is, a lot of us are probably trying casein for the first time. We might not like casein. It might not be the medium that answers everything that we need, but it can fill in the gaps for other things like these color studies, or if you're traveling, it travels really well because it dries really quickly. You can use casein in sketchbooks. I've done that before. And or maybe you do love casein and it becomes your next primary medium. Um, but as an introduction, limiting our palette, I think, is actually more beneficial, right? Because it forces us to think about how am I going to get this to read like a really warm yellow, right? So the cooler I can make the shadow later on, the warmer this can start to feel, because again, it comes back to the relationships in the painting. All right, let's get some of the trunk shape filled in here. So I'm adding some white, a little touch of the phthalo green. Um, it's probably difficult to tell virtually, but my hand, when it comes to getting paint on the brush or mixing it in a pile, is really light, especially early on in the painting process. I don't want to get a ton of phthalo green in this mixture because it'll just take over that color. Um, so I would also encourage you to practice like using very small amounts of a pigment and seeing how much it tints or uh, shifts the pool that you're mixing on your palette.
Hector, can you use mediums with casein besides water?
Yeah, I know that Richeson has a medium, um, like an extender or a binder medium. I think it's part of it is the binder in the paint itself. So it's kind of like if you're an oil painter and you're adding linseed oil to your paint, it's kind of a similar, relationship of materials, but I've always kind of just used water, to be honest. And um, I like the simplicity of that because, you're eliminating some of the variables. And I think when we add more things to our process, it becomes more to juggle, right? It's like, well, how did I get that mixture? Or how did I get that consistency? Or what brush was I using? And that can actually kind of slow us down in the process. Um, so, but to answer the question, yes, there is a medium
Mhm.
that you can use with
Cool.
casing.
And would would you seal the painting when you're done? And if so, what medium would you use?
Yeah, really good question. This is something that kind of really opened my world to gouache and casein painting is, because most of my paintings are made with oils, so I don't have to worry about I can varnish them, but I can leave them sort of open to the elements. And with gouache, as I mentioned, it's really fragile with moisture. But I forget where I learned. I wish I could remember who I learned this from because I've told tons of people about this. You can do a two-step process, and this might be, familiar to some of you, but once the painting is fully dry, if you spray it with a matte varnish, I think Krylon makes one. Once that is dry, then you can use a wax medium. I've always used
Mm.
Dorland's wax medium
Mm.
as the top coat. And so what we're doing then is we're creating like this two-step process to protecting the painting. You're protecting against UV, so the light fastness of the pigment has a better
Okay.
chance if you're using the varnish. And then against moisture, the wax medium is helping against the moisture possible issue there. But yeah,
Cool.
really good question. All right, let's see, where are we at here? Um, so I have this kind of like cool, minty green, kind of grasshopper green color on my palette at the moment, and I'm looking for areas in the painting that have this cooler green temperature. And there's not many, but there are a couple areas. And one of those areas that I really love is this section of the doors below the driver's side of the car, under the windows there. There's this like slight angle to that part of the car. And so its properties of color are different than the base of the doors and like the main panel on the left side of the car. And when you look at that little shape, you can see it's much cooler in its green hue than the side that's, the bigger shape. And part of that is that it's angling away from the ground plane, right? So we're not seeing the warmness bouncing onto that little strip of the side of the car, as opposed to this larger shape is going to be slightly warmer. Let's go ahead and get some titanium white, a little bit of yellow ochre. So I'm still staying in a green adjacent mixture here. I just want to get rid of some of the white of the paper. So I'm going to glaze over this, right? And when I say glaze, you can really see that where I'm not losing that initial part of the painting there. Those darker lines are still in the painting. And just going to cover up this card. It's darker than the reference, which is fine, but I just need to get rid of the white of the paper. That's sort of the goal of what I'm doing right now. Okay, now let's get the sky in there. So earlier I mentioned that we don't technically have a blue on the palette, but relative to the red and the yellow and the brown, the raw umber, the phthalo green is the coolest color that we have in terms of temperature. And so this is where I look at a reference with a limited palette. I'll look at my reference and I'll go, okay, what's the bluest color that I see? And I would for sure look at the sky. Like that's pretty blue. So I have to think about, all right, with this palette, this is my bluest like range of this limited palette. So I have to reserve the phthalo green with white and its more pure mixture for parts of the sky. And what will happen is that it will read as a blue in relationship to other shapes below the sky, right? So again, as I was saying before, it's really so much painting is about understanding the relationships and those contrasts of the relationships. And if we can just focus on those properties of hue and value and chroma, everything starts to look in a way sort of abstract, right? It's just this method of understanding the relationships as abstract relationships of color and shape and proportion and all that stuff too. Um, but given the limitations of the palette, I don't want to go and grab an ultramarine blue or a phthalo blue or a cerulean blue. I want to work with this palette, and it'll still read and make sense as long as I don't use this color in other areas to compete with the sky. All right, so I'm just adding white to tint this up, and it looks slightly warmer as the sky is reaching down towards that telephone pole and the tree line. So I'll add a little bit of yellow ochre just to warm it up. Right, and again, this is the benefit of using a limited palette. If you're looking at a mixture on the palette and thinking, wow, that's really blue. It doesn't look that blue in the reference. It's a little bit warmer. Well, then you have a few options, right? You can make it warmer towards red and neutralize the green. You can make it warmer towards yellow and pull the mixture towards more of a yellow green. And it's just, in my opinion, it's always helpful to limit the choices. That way you can focus on other things like drawing or perspective or values. But if you're someone who's interested in plein air painting, I would also recommend Casein. It's really handy outdoors. I've mentioned a couple times that a lot of my work is made with oil paint, and one of the challenges with painting with oils outside is that you have to figure out how to get this wet painting back to like your car or your house and then the gallery, and it just becomes a logistical challenge depending on what you're using, the size of the painting, what traveling looks like for you in that moment. And with casein, you have the benefit of knowing it's going to dry really fast. And that you just have to wait a little while, and then you can put it in a folder or put it in a portfolio and go about your day. It's a nice benefit to the medium. The other thing that I did not demonstrate that I also really like about casein is that if you're someone who loves to draw and you're really comfortable with drawing and working with pencil and paper, casein works really well on top of drawings. I didn't want to start with a drawing because I feel like it's easy to be tempted to just sort of fill in the shapes and fill in those whatever you decide is your drawing. I wanted to work more with the brush and think about ways to manipulate the composition and the shapes just with a brush instead. But if you like to draw, it's another reason why I would recommend working with casein, um, because it layers over drawings really nicely. So I'm just looking for some darker shapes out in the background and start to think about this shadow that comes to a really satisfying little triangle here on the car. Let's see here. This is pretty standard for me in terms of the process. Usually I'll hit a point where I'm like, okay, I'm kind of establishing things. I like most of where things are located, what needs to adjust, and um, working with a medium that dries pretty fast like this is really helpful because you can leave an area for a few minutes and come back and it's pretty dry. But as you're noticing, when you glaze over a earlier dried layer of the painting, it's not like you're picking up all of that pigment and then mixing a new color like you would with gouache, right? This allows you to trust that like, okay, I can just build on top of that layer and it's not like I'm fighting this new mixture that's getting mixed on the painting in real time, right? So again, this is another reason why I really enjoy and appreciate casein. And one thing I would say too, like, you know, because everyone has different aesthetic tastes, right? And my aesthetic is very rooted in shape, and I like geometric shapes a lot. I really like working with angles and if you're someone who really likes soft atmospheric edges, it's possible to get softer, transitions of contrast, kind of like on the left side of this tree line at the moment. Um, but in terms of like really, really perfectly smooth blending, that's not how I use casein. I'm sure you could replicate some of that level of softness, but um, chances are it's probably going to be done with a dry brush and just sort of like feathering your edges or transitions of color properties. Okay, let's see.
Hector, Lisa is asking if you found that you made an error on a dark area and need to fix it to a light color, do you
Hmm.
overlay an opaque color over black, or should you start by repairing with white, not watered down, and then build over?
That's a really good question. That happens to me all the time. And not even just with KC, it happens with all mediums I'm working in. And what I would recommend, especially as something with casein where it dries really fast, let it dry, mix up a new color or like get back to that area of your color palette that gave you that dark, adjust those properties that you feel like need to be adjusted on the palette, and then just go right over that. And I don't know if there's a secret, method in terms of like how opaque or transparent should that be. Um, I would say like just try it, see what happens. If you can still see the darker shape below it, let it dry, go back over it a third time then and correct or even out some of those contrasts. Hopefully that helps to answer the question. All
Cool.
right, so
Is there a certain amount of layering that you can do with casein, or is it just as much as you want?
and from what I've seen, I haven't hit a point where it's like the paint isn't accepting more paint. So in my experience, you can put a lot of layers into this medium. And the one thing I've heard, or I don't think I've seen this firsthand, but if you have, especially if you're working on paper, and if you have a really, really thick impasto passage of paint of casein, it might have a challenge in staying fixed to the surface. So I would be cautious of using too much paint, especially really early on in your painting process. But for that reason, that it might not grip as strongly as it did initially. But that's not a common story, or like I can't think of an example where that's happened to me. But as you can tell, I'm working with fairly thin layers of paint.
Mhm.
I'm sure you could use thicker passages of paint if you wanted to, but just something to keep in mind. Okay, let's see. Let's kind of warm things up a little bit here. Add a little bit more alizarin to this ochre mixture here. Start to get into that really satisfying rusty orange and red shape on the top of the car. There's some orange and red notes in the trees that I can also add in at this point as well. I'm just going to vary the shapes here. I'm just trying to create this feeling of organic material. And again, I can glaze over this if I want to later on. There's also a little pile of leaves on the back window. All right, now let's add some white. So the chrome on the back bumper is picking up a lot of the reflected properties of the ground plane. So I'm just going to kind of glaze a warmer layer over part of that back bumper, right? And it'll start to feel like, oh, the light is bouncing off the ground plane up onto the bumper. Again, this goes back to like my box preliminary sketch that I talked about, where it's like, how do we think about the way that the light is bouncing and shifting what we would call the local color of the object? So we know that this is kind of like a uh, a green that's sort of almost the only thing that's coming to mind is like a asparagus or pea soup green for some reason. I can't think of a better description of the color of the car. I'm not really a car guy. I was going to say that at the beginning of the presentation. I like to paint cars. I don't like to pay to fix my car. I don't like to build cars. So I was wondering, I'm like, hopefully nobody has any questions about the car because I probably won't know a lot about the car. Um, but anyway, so the local color of this car is that kind of green, but that green is shifting in temperature based on the light that's bouncing onto it from the ground plane. All right, so now I'm just going to want to make kind of a purpley bluish gray to describe some of the shadows in the parking lot because this still needs to get filled in over here. That's too dark. Let's add a little bit of white. Maybe I'll thin out my brush a little bit with water. So I'm moving fast here. I'm gonna try to plug in a bunch of stuff as I'm still chatting. Let's just fill this whole shape in back here. Right, because I need this shadow to be cool in temperature, but I don't want it to match the sky, right? Because that'll get confusing if it's the same color as the sky. So it needs to be darker, maybe a little less chromatic, so it's slightly more neutral. And it's pretty opaque. This is probably one of the first times I'm really using more opaque paint. But now I can kind of bounce around and see if there are other areas where I can sneak this same color into the painting. Again, for unity, uh, also to think about ways to connect the composition. There's also a nice shadow in the kind of in the foreground there below the car. So I'm going to add a little bit of white. It's slightly brighter in value. If you're looking at the shadows in the parking lot, the ones to the right of the trunk of the car, those ones are a lot darker. And then these ones that are here right next to the shadow underneath the car are a little bit lighter. And they also, to me, read slightly more chromatic, like a little bit warmer in temperature. So I'm going to adjust that color on the palette. Again, I'm still using the same brush. It's pretty cool just to see how far you can get with one tool like this. So same idea. I'm thinking about other areas where I might be able to use this same color that's on the brush. I'm gonna lighten this up a little bit actually, because I'm seeing that on the chrome of the bumper, there's this really nice, cool little reflection here in terms of temperature. The shape is cool looking, but usually I'm referring to temperature. Um, all right. Now let's see. This shape needs to get filled in. So I can see there's a house, part of a house in the background there. And it's a dark, sort of brownish green color. Some of the paint on my palette is still open enough to mix and borrow for new mixtures. So I'm just going to use what I already have on the palette, which is a combination of all three of the primaries. Um, Again, I don't want that color in the background of the house to be too chromatic, right? The foreground is what's really chromatic and pulling us into the foreground, right? So I'm going to try to keep things a bit more neutral back here. I'm just going to glaze over this whole area because I want to get rid of the white of the paper. Obviously, that's not the exact proportion and the right, size of the house by any means, but the value feels a little bit closer to what it's supposed to be. I think that's really the key thing at this stage. Um, One thing that's been bugging me is the roof of the house in the middle of the painting is a really nice kind of pinkish purple. And keep glancing at that part of my painting, and I'd love to see that closer to the reference. So let's mix up kind of a grayish pink purple. Right, and this isn't like a really thick layer of paint, but it's a bit more opaque than what I had on this area before. So it's going to do a nice job of creating more of a graphic shape. And when I say graphic, what I really mean is like a flat continuous shape in terms of color property. Casein works really well if you like that sort of aesthetic of painting, and you can get really nice, consistent shapes of color. And it also works well as we're seeing to vary your paint consistency and the transparency to opacity of your mixtures too. So it's pretty versatile in that regard as well. Now, the main shapes of the house, they're much cooler in temperature if we compare that to the roof. So I'm going to go back to my minty, cool green color here. I'm actually just going to take some of that roof color and mix it into that green because this is more of a reddish hue, right? So they'll start to neutralize each other, and it's pretty subtle, but it's enough to just kind of keep it from being too intense of a green. Let's see. This is too dark, so let's add some titanium white to that. Now, I might be moving pretty quick if you're trying to paint along with all of the same decisions that I'm making. Um, that's great. It's okay if you're sort of finding your own process forward in terms of what you're working on at what stage. Um, Either approach is going to work well. But again, I think the key thing is to really be looking for relationships and trying to compare the color properties of those relationships. I think that's really where we're going to find those moments of like, oh, that's reading like the car or like the tree line or the house. Okay. I think it's probably almost time to start working on our car again. This is the other thing that you're noticing is that I'll work on one area, then I'll leave and go work somewhere else, and then I'll come back to an earlier passage. That's pretty typical for the way that I like to paint. I think, again, I mentioned this before, but if we can practice shifting our attention around the whole painting kind of continuously, it's going to allow us to make corrections when it's a little bit easier to do so. I think if I would have spent this entire time just getting the car right, and then if I lean back and I go, uh-oh, the angle of the car is not right or the proportion's wrong, it's going to be really hard to want to change anything in the car because I'll have spent all of that time focused on painting the car. But if I can keep things pretty loose and malleable, then in my experience, it's really comfortable to be like, you know what, I'm just going to move the edge of that shadow, or I'm going to paint over that part of the, um, shape in the parking lot and so on. But let's get back to the car now. In my opinion, this is kind of the fun part of the painting is all these really interesting shapes in the car. So you can kind of reward yourself, right? If you spend some time painting the stuff where you're like, it's background information, or that's not really the thing I love about the painting. Do that stuff first, and then save the details or save the thing you're really excited about for the end. Um, in my experience, it's easy to get sort of pulled into this process where, you spend all this time painting the thing that you really love, and then you kind of lose interest for the rest of the painting. And part of the reason why the car is so interesting is because everything else is different than the car, right? So it's like you need to set the context for the car to shine and for the car to be what it is in the reference. So it's kind of what we're doing when we're focusing on all these other elements in the composition. We're setting up the opportunity for the car to really sing and be the main character of the painting. But I know that that can be challenging too when you're really excited about something. Okay, so now I'm kind of using a mix of different greens. You know, if you think back to the color chart that I showed on one of my slides, um, what I really love about making color charts is that they become evidence for the variety that a palette will give you, especially if you're thinking about one hue, right? So if we think about green as one hue, I do a lot of landscape painting and I'll hear students talk about like, how do you mix green? And they talk about green like it's this, like it's the thing they have to conquer in their landscape paintings. And it's kind of true. Like, I'm not going to disagree that green isn't, kind of finicky and challenging, but when you make a color chart, you kind of you're showing yourself ahead of time the type of greens that you have access to. So you'll see you have really rich, warm greens. You can have really cool, um, you know, uh, kind of ghosty greens. And the beauty of the color chart is that you're not trying to make a painting, you're just trying to see those relationships of the palette, right? So you're not really worried about drawing and perspective and proportion. It's just to help you recognize the variety that this particular palette will give you in your painting process. All right, let's get into the window there. There's a really satisfying kind of green filter through these old windows of the car. And I really love what that does to the information that's through the window, right? Because we know that there's another car behind the Bel-Air and there's trees through there, but the window is sort of filtering the properties of those objects, and we're getting to see a more greenish version of the trees or the car behind this Bel-Air. Now, I mentioned earlier that in my initial painting, I was using a slightly extended palette. I said that I had introduced a cadmium yellow into the process. And when you mix the cadmium yellow with the phthalo green, you get this really electric kind of range of greens. Um, so, you might find that this palette isn't giving you everything that you want your paintings to have. So I would definitely encourage you to try out some of the other pigments that they offer in this line of paint. It's a really generous catalog of colors, and Richeson is one of the few companies that produces this paint. Um, and I'm always proud that I share the same state as the company. Also, I'm always like, try Richeson, look at Richeson. All right, so I'm just trying to go in here, bring the value down in the windows. There's some interesting shapes and reflections on this window of the second car back here. And this is where I would encourage people to not overthink those shapes. I don't think it's important to try to get your shapes to be the exact, character and size of what you're seeing in the photo. You're more than welcome to aim to replicate those details, but this is a great area of the reference where you can kind of play with how you want to um, represent those reflections in the reference or in your painting. I'm seeing where the window is reflecting a little bit of the sky, so it's slightly cooler in temperature over here. Looks like I also need to pull the edge of the car a little bit more towards the right, correct some of these proportions. So my brush. All right, now let's work on this driver's side plane of the car. So I know my green is going to be warmer, but it's not super cool. So I need to warm up the phthalo green with yellow, maybe a little bit of raw umber. If you want to neutralize it, you could, the rose red that you have would work well to do that. Let's see what this looks like here. Could probably also use this for part of my shadow. Now, it seems like at the nose or the front end of the car, it's pretty dark. This green is pretty dark, so I'm going to start by establishing the value of that. Again, I'm always thinking about where I can move the same color around picture. All right, now it's getting lighter as we move towards the back end of the car. It also seems to be a little bit more yellow. See what this feels like. This also gives me a chance to correct some of the shapes in this part of the painting. And again, this is what I love about painting, right? We can choose to just work more loosely in the beginning and then correct things as we continue to navigate the process. So much of painting is this act of discovery, and as you put in more and more elements into your painting, you start to discover what's working and what's not working. And again, it's like if you have something on the surface of the painting, it's going to give you insight into what could change and maybe what should change for what reason. Right. So the back end of the car here, kind of by the gas tank there, looks a little bit cooler in its temperature. So I'm going to add a little bit of white and a little bit more phthalo green. What I'm trying to do is distinguish those two planes where the car kind of has this middle crease down its paneling that's at a diagonal, so we can see these temperature shifts in each of those planes. And the lowest one that angles in towards the wheels and towards the ground plane is the warmest, especially on the back end of the car there. So I'm going to really think about my yellow ochre as a way to show that warmth of the light bouncing out of the car. suggest a little bit of that division of planes. I would be careful. I would be hesitant or careful about seeing a crease or an edge between two planes and making a continuous line all the way across. I would encourage people to like use more of a broken line in that sort of crease of the planes. It might make it feel a little bit more natural when we connect things. It's sort of like outlining, right? And that can start to create this impression that something's very flat. Um, and a lot of times we don't even realize that we're describing something that way. And I'm definitely I've been in that experience before. All right, let's see. What else can I start to put in here? I go work for a moment here on the details of the trunk in the back of the car. Um, Areas like this I really enjoy because they're so unique in like the proportions, right? This crease on the back of the car is a really satisfying shape and angle, and each of these little kind of shadow shapes has a slightly different character of color property. So, like the darkest one that has almost a slight V shape is pretty neutral, and then this one over here is a little bit lighter and it has more of a green hue, a little more of a chromatic color to me. So let's put that in there. It's almost time to start thinking about the trunk, the car. There's also a really satisfying, vibrant triangle. That's the hood of the car from this angle. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in real quick. Grab some white, yellow ochre, a little touch of phthalo green, maybe some more yellow, just to keep it chromatic. When you're tinting up your colors, adding white will give things a kind of a chalky effect. And if you're lightening your values, especially if it's going to be a warmer shape or plane, adding in a little bit of ochre or a yellow is going to help make it feel a little bit more chromatic and vibrant than if you just used white. And that's something that I think a lot about regardless of the medium that I'm using.
Hector, just wanted to give you a time. We're just under just before 2:40, so we got about 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it goes by fast. All right, so let's start to distinguish the trunk of the car, which is a really bright, almost washed out color. So it's mostly white, but I'm going to add a little bit of yellow, maybe a little bit more white. It's more yellow and white. I think with the remaining time that we have, I'll try to tighten up some of the details in the car. Um, Hopefully, between the initial reference of the painting I had made prior and seeing where I'm at this stage in the painting process, the remainder of the process is going to look a lot like this, what I'm doing now. just a matter of correcting proportions and shapes and adjusting slight variations of color properties. So uh, once this concludes, it would look a lot like what you're seeing right now. And then we can also start to bring in some of the unique details in the composition. So we have that like rusty red on the top of the car. We've got these red lights, these tail lights in the car. So I'm going to use the same brush here still. Looks like I'll be using the same brush for the entire demo today. When I made my first reference for this painting, I was using each of those other brushes a little bit more towards the end of the process. I think, once I needed a finer line or just a smaller rectangular shape, these other brushes are really helpful for those varieties. Let's add in some yellow to that alizarin there. Just gonna put a few marks of this rusty red into top of the car, but also in the tree line where I'm seeing some of those warmer fall leaves or early fall leaves. Quarter-inch flat brush here. I'm going to use this to paint in the second car and correct some of the edges here. There are areas of our sort of main character car that have really intense highlights, and I don't usually use pure white to represent highlights, but that can work really well just to keep the contrast and that focus on the foreground if you want to use basically like a pure white in those really high key areas of the reference. All right, got that over there. So now I'm looking at just a few areas that I hadn't gotten to, including this tree that's in the middle of the composition of the painting. And I can use the color of the tree to correct the edge of that white car that's in the middle ground there. I also get some variety in the foreground of the trees as well, just with the last couple of minutes here. You can see it's kind of got a dry brush texture.
Hector, Lisa is asking, do you ever use casein as an underpainting for your oil paintings when you paint en plein air or back in the
Um,
studio?
no, that's a good question. I haven't tried that. I'm sure you could do that. The only thing is that with oil, you really want to make sure that you're priming your substrate so that it's able to accept the possibility of oil soaking into it. So with, gessos and things like that, I know that you can use casein on primed hard boards. I have some artist friends that use casein in that way. And I know of artists that have used casein as an underpainting for oil painting. So yeah, I would definitely give that a shot if it's something you're interested in trying. If you want to take this medium outdoors, because I think yeah, it would work really well if, you're just trying to establish some of the key relationships in a painting, especially proportions and values and that kind of stuff. And then you kind of get the best of both worlds in terms of surface quality and blending options. Just trying to correct some of the background here the last couple minutes. Let's see. Also add in the stripe or the parking spot if you want.
This is a great question. How long does it take casein to cure if you want to varnish it later?
Um, that's a really good question. I don't know if I have like a exact number of hours that I can give, but in my experience, I usually try to let it dry for at least a couple hours, if not like overnight, and then that way I know for sure like all the moisture is out of the paper. And that would be the thing I would recommend is like if it feels like it's still kind of cool or damp on the back or on the front, I would let it just dry a little bit longer rather than taking a chance of having moisture, mess with the varnish.
And I know casein has been used in cave painting, so I know that it's not going to become crazy moldy, but somebody is asking if because it's milk based, does that mean the paint will degrade over time?
Not in my experience. No, I think it's really durable and really archival. Um, the, in terms of like moisture and mold, I've never seen that become a problem like with the materials or on the paintings. I will say there was one or two times when I was using gouache where, I had mentioned I like to use it in a watercolor metal palette. And didn't have time to let the palette dry out enough, and I closed it up and I put it into a bag. And the next time I went to paint, there was a little bit of mold in the palette, but I think that was just because of the like trapping of the moisture. Um, I haven't seen that with casein though. Those are fair questions. Just yeah, to kind of gauge your process and your timing of using the material and all that kind of stuff. It's helpful to know how it's going to behave.
These are great questions. So if anyone else has any questions towards the end, please let us know. Pass them on to Hector.
Yeah, please. Happy to help.
Got a couple questions here. For your paintings on watercolor paper, do you mount it later on an archival board with PVA before framing?
Yeah, that's you can mount the paper before or after you make the painting. If you have the space and the time to do it before, that's certainly like saves a lot of the headache. Especially if you have any texture that you're worried about losing when you're mounting it with, I use like artist books to kind of weigh down my paper panels, but you can do it at either time. Yeah, and I'll use like plywood, like cabinet grade plywood, like this kind of stuff. And to help protect the wood and the painting, if you can create a barrier between the two before you glue down the paper, you can use mediums like um, GAC 100 from Golden. That's a medium I've used before. Any kind of matte medium like that, I think would work to seal it. I know artists that will use rabbit skin glue, if you're into like traditional mediums to seal and size your organic substrates, or you can use an aluminum panel that's becoming more and more popular these days. It's a little bit more pricey, but that's ensuring that your painting has got the best possible protection as, if you have access to ACM or yeah, those aluminum composite material boards.
And there's a question. This is I'm curious to know. Can you paint casein on copper?
I don't know. I've never tried that before. That's a really interesting question because, yeah, I've only really ever used it with paper substrates. I like the absorbency of the paper. Um, I don't know on copper how durable, I've made paintings with oils on metal panels before, and I've had moments where I've accidentally like brushed up against it, or it sort of slipped and got a scrape through the paint because it's such a slick surface. I think it's a little bit more susceptible to like scraping off. I don't know what casein would look like in that regard, but anything I think is worth experimenting with materials like that. So yeah, could try it out. Um, but again, I think with my experience, the way I like to use casein is kind of in this variety of transparent, opaque layering, and to be able to let those washes soak into the paper early on, is how I've gotten used to using this medium. But yeah, really good question.
How do you think it differentiates between acrylics?
So with acrylic, because you have a plastic binder in the medium as like the vehicle for your pigment, you have paintings that are really slick and that just have that plastic, because it is plastic, you have that sort of feel and touch. I think they dry in kind of similar ways on your palette. I mentioned that casein has more of a matte finish than acrylic paint does, but on your palette, if I was going to keep painting for another 2 or 3 hours, eventually the surface of my paint piles here will start to skin over, and it can be challenging to get to um, the like soft wet paint. It doesn't dry out completely when that starts to happen, but putting your paint out on a wet paper towel, again, it extends that working time. Acrylic does the same thing. When you're using it on your palette, it will start to like skin over in that same way. Um, but both of them also have the benefits of transparent paint and opaque paint where you can thin it out and water it down or use mediums to get different consistencies of paint. But yeah, I think what I like about casein and gouache is that when you make a mark, both of those mediums are really, really good at kind of keeping the character of your mark that you make with your tool, your brushes. And they kind of freeze that expressive quality of your mark making, And acrylic, I think, can do that too. I don't really use acrylic that often these days, but I started with acrylics and then have since tried pretty much every medium that you can get today. From egg tempera to oils and watercolor. And I mentioned at the beginning of my demo that I make a lot of mistakes, so it's nice to have mediums where I can cover up those mistakes and correct those early um, stages of my paintings. But
Similar to the layout you have here, would you ever try to lay out gouache on a white wet paper towel?
yeah, yeah, a lot of artists that use gouache will work with it in that way. I don't know like offhand what the ratio of artists who prefer to use it like this or in like a dried out watercolor palette. Um, I know that it is pretty common to use it the way that I'm using it, where you're kind of just keeping it open during your painting session um, in this way. But again, I think it just depends on what your needs are and what your the time and space that you have to make your work, what that looks like. And putting my gouache into a travel palette it kind of opens up a convenience of time where I can throw it into a bag or a backpack. I can pull it out and just at the start of my session, I can re-wet the gouache in the palette, and then by the time I'm ready to start painting, it's usually pretty workable. Um, and I haven't had any issues with like the paint consistency feeling different when I use it that way. But yeah, great question.
It's amazing how quickly this has come together.
I'm glad you feel that way. I teach online for a university, a painting class, and it's so easy for me to just start chatting about ideas or the process, and um, I have yet to master talking and painting at the same time. But I uh, I really enjoy opportunities to get to teach and share things that have helped me over the years, and I'm always learning too. I definitely don't feel like I've learned everything I need to know, and um, when I'm thinking through some of these questions that people are sharing, it's really helping me remember that there's still so many different ways to think about the process and our materials. And ideally, that feeling will never go away. That's what'll keep us engaged as painters is just that feeling of what can I try out today or what can I learn when I go into the studio today. Um, so yeah, hopefully everyone who's trying casein today is having a really exciting experience.
So we have one last question from Lisa that we can squeeze in here. When you describe your painting for an art exhibition, do you title it as casein or watercolor? I've not seen many paintings listing as oil,
Yeah,
acrylic, watercolor, etc.
that's a really good question too. I would use casein on my website in my portfolio. Any paintings I've made with casein are listed as that medium because it is different from watercolor. I know watercolor, it has its own really specific and unique limitations in terms of the way that the paint dries. There's like the difference of transparent watercolor versus opaque watercolor when you're kind of dipping more into gouache. And, just as a way to distinguish and make sure that I'm categorizing things and labeling things correctly, I would totally just put casein as the medium anywhere where this is being published. Um, and I think it's also, I don't know, I think there's a lot of artists out there who maybe haven't heard of casein or haven't tried it or have seen how accessible or approachable it is as a medium. I think because it's opaque, but you can also thin it down like watercolor, it's a little bit more forgiving than traditional watercolor. Um, and yeah, you might be the next person to introduce someone else to this medium and open up their process to the benefits of casein. So I would totally recommend to list it as casein for that reason. But yeah, thank you for all the questions today. see. So got a few last minute shapes I can put into this back window. Almost there. I'll also get into some of the details inside the car too. Those are things that I usually would get to towards the end of the process, but I can show a little bit of those steps here before we wrap up. The other thing I'll just kind of say is that, with my process in particular, I mentioned this at the start of the demo too, that, I try to stay in kind of a muted range of colors early on. Um, and I had said this before too, that part of the reason is because you always have access to make things more chromatic if you work that way. If you stay in kind of a neutral middle area of chroma. Then, when it's time to put in like a really saturated moment, it's going to feel saturated because everything else is sort of toned down in its level of chroma. And, with my demo painting I made before, it hit a stage like this where things still felt a little bit less intense. But as I continued to build up the shapes and the layers and correct things, I would start to use more chromatic mixtures of colors. So that's something else that is really kind of nice about casein is that you can build things up slowly if you want to, or you can go right in with really intense colors right away if that's more of your aesthetic and the way that you like to describe things. It will work with both approaches.
So, Hector, do you have any last minute final tips that you want to share and impart on our group here today?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I would say have fun if you're new to this medium. If you're someone who likes to travel, bringing a couple tubes of casein is a really great idea. You can do a lot in a sketchbook if you're traveling. And then again, because it dries really quickly, you don't have to wait very long to be able to close up your sketchbook and continue about your day. Um, and if you're a studio painter, feel free to explore those other materials that were brought up today, like the copper panels or a wood panel. And just, be open to what's possible. I think that's what I would say and try to have fun. And, we used a very limited palette. So also I would encourage people to take a look and see what the other pigments that Richeson makes has available to you and where you might want to incorporate some of those other pigments into your process. But yeah, I think that's all I can think of at the moment.
Awesome, great. Like Jessica said, it was really cool to see how this came together so quickly, blocking it in and getting those tips on how to start and then build over time with the detail. So, yeah, this was really great. Thanks so much for the introduction to casein. We were excited to have this first time with this medium for Plaza art workshops. So, yeah, and everyone enjoyed it very much based on the comments. So, thank you so much, Hector, for joining us today and everyone else for participating, signing up. Hope to see you on the next one. Thanks so much for coming and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.